I want you to think back on the last 11 episodes of this trash fire. Think about what it was in a substantive sense. What was it trying to say? What was it trying to accomplish? What were its themes, its aesthetics, its messages, its tone? Think about all of the characters, about how to bring them to a satisfying place for the end of the season. What should happen to Chiyome, Arc, Ariane? What's a good way to take down this threat that's satisfying? If you thought of anything that made sense, then I promise you it's not in this episode. I want to open by talking about something that I've wanted to bring up for a while now, but that I never felt like I had the opportunity to. See, Arc, he has a catchphrase. Yeah, no, I'm serious. Hi, it's me, Arc. He opens just about every episode that way, and he says it at the end of the last episode too. In the original Japanese, it's Konnichiwa, Arc desu. He says this in his inner voice, which is to say his silly voice, as opposed to his knight persona. You get the feeling that the delivery is supposed to come off as quirky, but there's nothing really to the line itself that conveys much of anything. It hits that perfect sweet spot where they fail to accomplish something, but it also really feels like they think they succeeded. It's a pretty rough way to start every episode. Most of this episode is an action sequence interspersed with long bits of dialogue. So, the first thing the show does is highlight all of these rings in the Hydra that is letting the bad guy control it. At no point do people even bring up the possibility of targeting these rings, which makes the focus shot poorly advised. You're giving setup that you're not planning on paying off. The Hydra fires a bolt of water, and Arc manages to protect Ariane with his super shield that got set up in episode 2. He's really running into the negative consequences of how the show has thus far handled the power fantasy. So Arc's powers have been mostly framed so far in terms of how strong they are. Arc was completely able to bypass the strongest attack, the Basilisk, which emphasizes how much stronger Arc is than the Basilisk. But he basically does the same thing here, also using the shield. And this is the part of the episode where they're trying to build up how strong this enemy is, so it goes against the whole point of the scene. But it's actually worse than that. See, some amount of tension does get built here because there are some scenes between us seeing the detonation of the water blast and us learning Arc and everyone else is alright. There is some small amount of uncertainty here, however slight. But that means that the reveal that Arc just used his shield and that it worked fine doesn't just start us off on the wrong foot, it actively undoes progress. And progress this competently structured is actually pretty rare for this show, so losing it is a big deal. It's actually even worse than that. See, because of this built tension, we get some sense of expectation, which is let down by the solution not only being simple, but actively going against the idea that this is a meaningful escalation of the stakes, which makes the fact they throw in Arc being relieved he activated the shield in time, a limp-wristed attempt at making it seem like this really was more dangerous than the Basilisk for him, the same kind of annoying that his stupid catchphrase is. I can get into a scene which isn't super great, but it loses me when the author pats themselves on the back for it. The wall climbing bit from Attack on Titan's 5th Core is objectively stupid. And the time it takes the armored titan to climb this wall, Irvin is able to have an internal monologue long enough that people ask him to hurry up, and they're able to concoct a fairly complicated plan which involved a lot of back and forth to explain. However, you can kind of just go with that because the story doesn't dwell on the kind of stupid moment from earlier. They just move on to a fight scene and leave the fiction that what just happened totally made sense up to implication and tone. Isayama and the poor sods who had to animate this just moved forward with absolute confidence and swept us up in it. Sure, it was a bit weird at the time, but that feeling faded and they were able to capitalize on the parts of the scene that did work. This line from Arc, though, isn't trying to make good on the tension from earlier. As far as the show is concerned, the tension was paid off when they showed off the fact that Arc and his friend were okay. And maybe you count the reveal that he used his shield as a payoff, even though we would have just assumed it. Him saying this line is, in practice, backfill. It solely exists to convince you that what just happened wasn't stupid, which just makes it that much more obvious that it was stupid. Maybe it could get away with this if him saying this was used as a setup to talk about how fast the Hydra's attacks are or how tired Arc is after the previous fight. That would build tension and probably would have succeeded in salvaging this questionable decision, but it doesn't, because it somehow gets even worse. This scene is meant to be a low point, and what dialogue do they throw into this low point? Chiyome making a comment about how strong Arc is. Brilliant, you just made the problem worse. Ariane reveals that she was conscious while she was being controlled, and so she heard about all the terrible stuff the villain did, and now she's pissed. Arc goes after the Hydra, while Chiyome and Ariane go after the villain. Alright, we're progressing into the bulk of the conflict. I should say that Arc actually has a pretty good line here about the Hydra being killable. This is just a good line on its own, and it shows off how his confidence in his abilities leads to him believing in solutions others wouldn't consider. This actually makes use of the power fantasy at a basic thematic level. We then take a break from the action to check in with the Emperor, which we'll talk about in a bit. The Hydra gets close to town, and the town guardsmen sound the bell for evacuation. However, Arc comes in with one of his signature attacks, but it doesn't deal meaningful damage. He then changes it into 2 more attacks we had seen him use till then. Fumba expresses shock at how strong Arc is, after which Arc dodges an attack by teleporting. He then gets grabbed by the Hydra. The Hydra tries to fire at him, willing to sacrifice a head to kill him, and so he blocks the attack with his shield. It accidentally causes some water to deflect and hit the town. Finally, he cuts off several heads with one of the attacks we've seen him use before. The Hydra regenerates, and Arc reassesses the situation. Alright, let's dissect this travesty. So the first thing to show here is that there's no variation in the fight's flow. Every interaction more or less goes the same way. When Arc sees that the Hydra didn't take much damage from his first attack, there's not much of a difference compared to when he sees that it survived his next attack. Now, the second time is slightly more victorious, with Fumba commenting on Arc's strength and the Hydra falling over, but there's no attempt to make contrast. If after his first attack we saw him acting somewhat worried, or Fumba acting cocky, then it would make it so this next moment could have an impact, but as it is, it's just radio static. There is an attempt to push the battle more towards the Hydra's side for a bit, but Arc acts so completely unconcerned that you aren't worried at all either, and the whole moment doesn't get much done. Now, you can have a cocky, unflappable protagonist, but you need to do something to make the viewer either doubt if they should be that confident or be unsure what they could possibly do. Here, we can think of a few things that Arc could do. When he escapes, it's not an exciting moment because we knew it would happen, and him taking out some of the town is more used for comedy than drama, which is an okay choice in a vacuum, but it's in a scene that's desperately starved for drama and stakes. When he takes out the heads, they regenerate right away, and he isn't shaken this time either. The only real escalation is the type of injury the Hydra instantly recovered from. This was supposed to be an exciting climax, but like earlier, there's no contrast to make it work as a climax. So what the author is utilizing here is called Kisho Tenketsu, or the 4-act story structure, which is a common story structure in Japanese media. Act 1 is when he tried his first attack. It establishes the scene. Act 2 is when he followed it up with more attacks that we've already seen him use. It elaborates on the setup from Act 1. Act 3 is when you shake things up and add a new twist. In this case, it's him being captured. Act 4 is where you resolve the ideas set up in Act 1 and Act 3 all at once. This happens by him escaping capture by using attacks we've already seen him use. On a surface level, this seems like it'll work, but it's all glued together very poorly. See, the way this resolves the third act makes some sense. He got into a really bad position, and then got out of it. But the way it resolves the first act can't really even be considered a resolution. His first attacks didn't work, and this one didn't either. It is true that it brought back the ideas introduced in the first and second acts and returned ourselves to the old status quo, and there is some innate satisfaction in that, but consider the things which he returned to. First, Arc ended in the same spot as before, and second, he continued to use his old attacks, this time his strongest one. The first one is fine, but the second one only has to do with Arc. It's not about the Hydra or Arc's relationship with it, or even about the current conflict. Now, you could make this pretty satisfying with some workshopping, but it would require you to imbue his old attacks with some emotional meaning beyond nostalgia. You'd have to give Arc some internal conflict that he just doesn't have in this scene, like maybe him doubting if his attacks are even good enough to do anything, only for him to prove himself wrong, or maybe him going on some speech about how his memories give him strength and each of these attacks has meaning to him. As things are, though, this is less drama and more a drama-shaped whole. There's nothing to chew on, both in terms of the action and in terms of the story being told via that action. One more thing before we move on, and that's that right before he gets captured, he just used his teleport. It was on our minds, and it was not only an obvious solution to the problem, it was a better one than the one he used. Next, Arc declares that he has another ace up his sleeve, which he hadn't used till then, which is incredibly powerful and that he can only keep up for 5 minutes. It's a demon he can summon that's as large as the Hydra. We're gonna get a kaiju battle. The girls are in awe, but then they keep going and find Fumba's the name of the villain, by the way. He mocks them and says they're nothing compared to the Hydra, a taunt which makes no sense given how A, the Hydra is far away and dealing with something, B, the Hydra mostly uses AoE attacks and wouldn't be able to discriminate between friend and foe, and C, they are right next to him and would be able to kill him in less time than it would take for the Hydra to charge up an attack. Ariane's response, however, is that it doesn't matter because the Hydra's power is not his own and he himself is weak, and... Okay, let's talk about some of those scenes we skipped. So, Fumba is from some tribe or whatever. In the flashback, he's whining about how he's not being recognized for his power to some elder. But the elder says that Fumba is weak and that he has sought out superficial strength. They say he's devoid of discipline. He goes to the Emperor, who agrees to have Fumba work for him if Fumba can be useful. And we're just gonna fly right past the fact that the good guys in this flashback are focused on strict traditionalism and are avoidant of new ideas due to perceived danger, only to be immediately juxtaposed by a villain explicitly stating he doesn't care about things like racial superiority, instead caring about a person's merits. You know, character writing. Actually, you know what? We're not gonna zoom past that. Who cares if this episode goes out late? No one's getting this far. I'm making this video for me. This is the most we see of Fumba's home in the entire season, and it's shown in one of the most stereotypical ways imaginable. It's just some old man who seems vaguely spiritual, preaching about discipline in such abstract terms that it's almost surreal. It's a scene that relies more on you not liking Fumba than thinking this person has a point. Because this stuff about what real strength is will be the focus of this episode, but Fumba wasn't flawed because his powers were the wrong type of powers. It's because he's a terrible person. I guess you could argue that his power comes from robbing others of their will, therefore making him less empathetic, more inclined towards cruelty, but that's not the argument that the show puts forth. They talk about how his power isn't his own, and he seeks to paste over his weakness rather than growing strong, but that's not what made him feed a woman to a Hydra. The whole sequence also kind of implies that he did what he did in search of recognition. He had a wounded ego because his people didn't accept him and didn't make an attempt to understand how we feel, so he clung to the first person who would acknowledge him as worthy, and that person happened to be a tyrant. There's no evidence of him doing any evil before he started working for the Emperor, with the exception of enslaving monsters, but this show really makes it look like anything you do to monsters is morally acceptable based on how Ark and his friends have zero issue slaughtering them despite the fact that they're being compelled to fight by magic. So it seems like the Emperor was an escalating factor in his moral downfall. And in this situation, where Fumba is framed as having made a Faustian bargain with a terrible person, the author decides to emphasize, as a central point of focus in this scene, the fact that the Emperor doesn't care about Fumba's ethnic origins in a show about how racism is bad. How easy do you need this to be for you to not screw it up? And so that brings us to Ariane, quoting this guy's ancestor almost verbatim somehow, which just makes it feel like the author is speaking, not the character. And that makes it really significant that this criticism makes no sense. So, okay, here's how this idea is used throughout the episode. He gets told by Ariane that he himself is weak. To make up for this weakness, he makes a big deal out of the fact he can control the Hydra, and she says that he tramples over the weak to distract himself from his own weakness. She claims that people who are truly strong do not become conceited and that they use their power to protect the powerless. She explained that that's the kind of strength she seeks. He says that no one wants to admit how strong he is, and so he's going to crush them. He tries to control her again, but she kills the imps before they can take control of her. Chiyome takes out the tattoos on his body, which glow when he commands the Hydra, so that he can't command it anymore. Both of those are pretty alright moments. He laughs about how the Hydra is now going to destroy everything. It's out of control. And she says it'll be alright because Ark will defeat it. The theme song starts playing, Ariane starts fighting him, overpowers him, he begs for forgiveness, and she kills him. We then see Ark proceed to use his strength that he did not work for, plus the help of a demon he summoned and is controlling, to take out the Hydra. Are you guys starting to see the problem here? So, this is really bad. This story gave us a pretty muddled thesis statement here. There are two types of strength, the true kind and the fake kind, and two different sets of criteria are given to separate the two. The first is that fake power is power which is not your own, whatever that means. The second is that true power is used for good and doesn't make you conceited. Now, I know these are two separate sets of criteria because they don't necessarily have correlation. They're not saying the same thing in two different ways. I suppose it could be trying to say that having power which is not your own leads to you being conceited and evil, but that's kind of undermined by the fact that Ark is used as an exemplar of true strength, and he did not work for his powers at all. They are not his. From what we see of Fumba, though, he did work for his fake power. He invented the rings and learned how to use them effectively and raised monsters to do his bidding. Ark was just gifted his strength. The only conclusion you can therefore draw is that the thesis of this episode is that whether or not power corrupts literally has to do with whether or not that power involves relying on others for assistance instead of relying on power which is yours, in the sense that it literally comes from your body without the aid of other actors. By this logic, though, the power of friendship is a gateway drug to genocide. Anyways, the start of the theme song plays while Ariane kills Fumba, and then the chorus plays while Ark and his demon kill the Hydra. Ariane comments on how Ark talks about wanting a quiet life, but seems to enjoy making a spectacle of things, and yeah, that sure was a character trait that I guess was supposed to be significant. After that, we learned that Yuriarna succeeded in her negotiations with the elves and started forging her way to peace. During this, though, she requests their assistance in getting her to inherit the throne, because she's the only possible heir that they can trust. A rather interesting proposition with a lot of implications, which is immediately brushed by so they can talk about that one human-elf couple and how it means that the world is moving forward. Yay! Because of this deal, the kingdom is now officially in the process of working to dismantle the slave trade, meaning Ariane is out of a job. So I guess we did get a systemic solution in the end as a sort of deus ex machina. Far more time is spent on the two of them mulling over the lesson she learned from Karsi, though, and they talk about how the time Karsi hoped for, where elves and humans can live together in harmony, might be here sooner than they thought. There's nothing wrong with that note to end on, but it really is hitting me that they seriously just finished on the note of, alright guys, we did it. We solved racism. We get some teasing for the next plot arc, and we did it, guys. We made it. We're done. We're finished. Holy crap. I gotta write a conclusion for this, don't I? Skeleton Knight in Another World is bad, and I don't like it. The end. You know what? Hold up. I do have some things to say to close this out. Now, I've been very mean to this show over these past 12 videos, especially with how it handles social issues, and if I were to sum up my accusations over how it handled race in one word, that word would be naive. And looking back, I don't know how happy I am with that takeaway. Naive is certainly how the story reads, don't get me wrong. Its takes are very milquetoast, surface-level niceties that fail to really interrogate the nuances of the problem it's tackling. But what I failed to mention was the thing that this show got really, really right, and that is the level of weight it pays to the topic of racial injustice. This is a story about the slave trade, and say what you want, it treats itself like it's a story about the slave trade. It puts a lot of drama behind how cruel the system is, and it takes a lot of time to analyze different facets of it. It knew it was taking on a big topic, and so it dedicated a lot of time and energy to tackling it. But it just didn't have enough to say. It carved out a huge amount of space for this one topic and filled it with next to nothing. Episode 10 is a good example of this. They dedicate an entire episode to exploring the idea of racial harmony, but the main message they were building up to didn't need that much build-up, and so there wasn't much to put in there. They were right to dedicate a whole episode to this, but coming up with insightful commentary on complex social issues is hard. And while the end result certainly comes off as clumsy and even a bit offensive, I don't want to go too hard on it. Writing stuff like this is hard, and it's actually really cool that so much effort went towards trying to make a positive message, trying to say the right things, trying to shine a light on the importance of genuinely important issues. In a sea of stories where chattel slavery is used as set dressing, this author dared to actually make a story about chattel slavery, and in spite of all of the slip-ups, genuinely came in with good intentions that the author followed through on. I said something earlier in episode 7. The author set out to make a bad story and succeeded. Let me rephrase that. The author is almost certainly better than this story. He is more talented than this story and capable of creating something far more substantive than it. One of the reasons bad isekais make me so fascinated is this very reason. So many times it feels like the genre is holding back the author. I still don't know how to end videos. Oh, right, I'm supposed to mention my Patreon. Like and subscribe. Patreon. Leave a comment for the algorithm. Seriously, guys, Sorry this took so long. I promise I'll be better.